based in Queens, Essex, and elsewhere, we've been exploring how reparations are dealt with in sort of ongoing conflict and post-conflict situations. Now, I am aiming this sort of talk at people who know very little about reparations and those who probably know more than me on reparations. So I hopefully hit a bit of a middle ground and keep your attention. Really, we've got our project with a lot of our data here at reparations.qb.ac.uk, and on that we've got a database where we're trying to collect good practices or just practices of states and jurisprudence on reparations. So far we've got over 330 data points, so like piece of legislation, case law, etc., from about 72 countries. And we hope that this will be something that will outlast the project as we continue to update it in years to come. We also have a number of project outputs, including reports, podcasts, and different outputs that we're working on in the past couple of years, but also we've got forthcoming stuff on handbooks and also our guidelines and reparations, which I'll talk about for a bit. Those things all said, I don't want to speak for too long today, because I hope that our conversation on reparations will sort of pick out some of the themes that I want to highlight. Really, where we've been starting with everybody in doing our research on reparations, in our ARCC funded project, we've interviewed about 300 people. And our first question is always, what do we mean by the word reparations? Because it's quite a malleable term. It means different things to different people. Both in sort of an international law context, but also in particular to their sort of cultural and social understanding of what reparations means to them. And so we've been trying to navigate this in terms of both a local perspective as well as an international one, in how to implement reparations, which lies at the heart of our project. And so today I want to pick out some of the basic findings and also the key tensions around doing reparations. So maybe for discussion, you could think, for you, what does reparations mean? For people we've engaged with, it's ranged from truth to justice to acknowledgement to getting revenge or retribution. So it covers a whole range of views, emotions, and interests in how to deal with the past. I suppose as an international lawyer, it'd be remiss not to start at the sort of chorizo factory, because it sort of shapes everything we do in international law. The reparations should, as far as possible, wipe out the illegal situation. And in this way, reparations are a way of undoing the harm in quite a legal understanding. 95 years, we can say that reparations have definitely evolved in a different way, and still in this light, but in a different way to how they're practiced and implemented. And this notion of chorizo, it continues to be reiterated in Inter-American Courts of Human Rights, domestic jurisprudence, as well as International Criminal Court. Taking their life into their own. The first interviews I did maybe about 6-7 years ago was on dealing with injured victims in Northern Ireland. And one of the first things they brought up was reparations. Well, isn't that the Treaty of Versailles? So this is the sort of starting point then we think about international law. At least in Ireland and UK, we are taught, the First World War and also this treaty, which imposes sort of a victor's justice on Germany to pay quite extensive reparations, but in practice didn't fully implement. And so it very much reflects the old way before chorizo, that reparations were an issue between states, effectively. And they were also about vindicating victors over the vanquished, whether or not their war was justified and how they fought it. This changed when we get to the Second World War. I'm just going to do a very, very brief introduction, the sort of historical background. But the Second World War changed things. We didn't do victor's justice. We did maybe perhaps victim's justice, or at least a legal form of justice. And the reason why I say a legal form, it wasn't moral justice. So the agreements that were made between Israel and Germany around the Holocaust weren't based on perhaps even a legal notion, but they were legalized through the Luxembourg agreements and subsequent German laws. And for the victims, they didn't want this to be moral justice. They didn't want to efface or remove the moral responsibility of the German people, the German government, for being involved in Nazi crimes. Now, what's interesting about reparations and something I hope to pull out through my whole discussion today, is that we often think as reparations as victim-centered, but actually there's something more deeper ongoing here, in that it involves society, but also responsible organizations. So as we see Germany introducing these laws domestically in the 1950s to include victims of the Holocaust, which there were very few left in Germany. At the height of it, was about 278,000 victims actually benefited. But what is happening there is also denazification. So the perpetrators are being brought back into the government system, into government jobs, and as civil servants. And this has implications for then the reparations process. We have doctors, judges, lawyers who are party carrying Nazis and adjudicating on cases, and also causing then further harm to victims who are coming forward. So it's quite a complex first step in sort of doing reparations. But it doesn't end, and it still hasn't ended. The seeking of reparations for the Holocaust and the conflict of the Second World War still is ongoing. And even in the US, where it interned Japanese Americans, it took them until 1988 before they got their reparations package through an apology and $20,000 each to be recognized. But that isn't where it stopped. And so the second sort of strand I want to put out today is that reparations are a struggle. It's a struggle about acknowledging the past and dealing with the past in a way, and this is incredibly difficult. And so post-1988, in the 90s and the early 2000s, we see reparations for the Second World War continue up and even till today, where you've got the forced labour claims against the German companies, you've got the Swiss bank litigation, you have the claims against the Dutch and French railways, in which last year the Dutch set up a specific scheme, but even that's been under repute this week. You have the claims against the German insurance companies, and you've also got outstanding claims, such as the Korean comfort women, where Japan doesn't want to fully recognize its responsibility and wrongdoing, but it's provided money to victims in a way to sort of buy off their claims. And a lot of the comfort women have rejected this. And it situates, how reparations, even 70, 75 years on, continue to be contested and struggled for, not just by the direct victims, but as you can see here, by their descendants decades on. And so the big shining edifice of reparations, the touchstone in which we talk about these sort of issues, is the UN Basic Principles on the right to remedy in reparations. Which, after years of negotiation and also the work of Van Boven and Basuni, came together to set out sort of broad principles on how to do reparations. It's the 15th anniversary this year in December of these principles, but they have been incredibly useful in courts and in domestic implementation and also litigation. But you can start to see the gaps, that it doesn't really give enough instruction to how states implement these in practice. It calls on broad things about adequate and effective reparations. It also calls on full reparations, which is an issue and sort of the third strand I want to talk about today. Now, perhaps one of the key innovators and the reason why we have the 2005 Basic Principles is because of the Inter-American Court and its jurisprudence in the 80s and particularly the 90s and early 2000s, which sort of fleshed out what we mean by reparations. And there's certain key cases. One I want to talk about is the Plan de Sanchez case. Clara Sandoval, based in Essex, and myself were lucky enough to visit Plan de Sanchez a couple of years ago and to sit down with some of the victims. And you can see the video we made with Don Juan on our website. And effectively, you have this case where during a conflict, but also a genocide in Guatemala in the 1980s, a whole village is wiped out. One village out of 600 other villages, which are the genocide there, which 200,000 victims are killed, and others suffer terrible sexual violence and torture. Plan de Sanchez was just one of these sites, but becomes a key part of the sort of developing reparations jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court, because it says there not just do victims get compensation, but a whole social development package, which includes the rebuilding of housing, of the construction of sewage and potable water, a whole range of things that goes beyond just what victims have suffered, but try to rebuild their community. But that decision was over 15 years ago. And so when we visited, the victims had this health clinic or court, but had no health supplies, didn't have proper health professionals to look after the community. And so Don, one picture here, is looking over his garden at the health clinic, where he grows some indigenous medicines in order to sort of supplement the lack of healthcare that they have there. And the town itself it still lives with the consequences of the genocide, but also this sort of tension with other communities, where this case has been prioritized above others because it reached the Inter-American Court. And it's the same with also other litigation, such as Rio Negro. These cases where victims have got more money compared to domestic national reparations program. And I know Clan has written extensively on these sort of tensions between regional courts and then domestic reparations programs, and some victims get more than others. And this sort of reflects some of the tensions within reparations, which I'll touch upon as well. I want to take a step back though, and maybe go back to that first question I asked about what do we mean by reparations? And for those who are familiar with the sort of literature on like the theorization of reparations, it sort of falls into three categories. And I suppose the Chorzo factory is about corrective justice. It's about the relationship between wrongdoer and those who've been wronged, between the victim and the perpetrator. And that the perpetrator has committed a wrong, is responsible for it, but should also take some efforts to undo that harm, to sort of wipe out the consequences of it. This is difficult in conflict, where you have thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of victims, as you have registered in Colombia. Distributive justice and sort of transformative justice look at the sort of structures of violence and try to tackle them. So in Guatemala, pictured here in the video COCOP, the key factors driving the violence and the genocide was the marginalization, discrimination against the Mayan indigenous people. And this is apparent in many of the other countries in which we worked in. Maybe not just the explicit ethnic and group marginalization and racism, but how people are pushed out of the sort of main political discourses and economic development and left at the margins, or suffer systemic abuse by the police or by state security forces that create this sort of historical grievance and how they're excluded from the country itself and also as a citizen with equal rights. And transitional justice has sort of dealt with this. And Paulo de Graaf, the godfather really of reparations, talks about reparations in trying to rebuild civic trust. And this is an interesting concept. Clara and I and other members of the team have discussed and also try to test out in the field, where if you make reparations, if you pay compensation, if you do the truth, if you do apologies, does that mean that those victims then trust the state? Now, we haven't done anything sort of quantitative, but we've interviewed a number of victims before and after they got reparations. And a good example of that is the Bloody Sunday victims, where we had a quite extensive truth process. You had the Prime Minister of the UK apologising for these victims who were civilians being killed nearly 50 years ago. And then over the past couple of years, compensation. And speaking to those victims well, I'll not say explicitly what they say, but they don't trust the state. They feel that the state can take the money and just stuff it. Because for them, it's the violence and the way in which the state denied and also continues to contest the past shows them a lack of good faith and a lack of reconciliation and sort of transition society on from the grievances of the past. The second sort of issue is then, how do we think of reparations in moral terms? That reparations are about acknowledging and vindicating victims, that they're innocent and never deserve this harm. And so acknowledgement and the sort of expressive notions that reparations is symbolic and has a message to it, that it reaffirms the value of individuals with dignity and human rights, has a lot of purchase in how we think about reparations in law and how we justify them, whether no law before, but also in terms of how we campaign. And so there's a very interesting nexus around how social movements use innocence in order to claim reparations based on their suffering. And so people talk about the moral economy of suffering, but there's dangers in that our victims then selling out their suffering in order to get money, or blood money. And it's also about seeing reparations differently in more symbolic terms, that not just only speak to victims and responsible actors, but how do we get society involved? Society which allowed these things to happen might have been complicit and encouraged it. And so key things like education, art, the creation of statues and memorials, creating physical edifices and public spaces to confront people with the violence of the past. And for most people in conflict, they will not be touched by the violence. They won't have the burden of the past through suffering, through loss of a loved one, through health or psychological complications to live with in the peace. So how do we get society to deal with this and care, really? And so some victims and some civil society actors we talked sort of spelled these issues out, that it's about speaking out, it's about ending impunity, it's about ensuring that we have values which underlie the law, the sort of justice, and the sort of transitional justice toolkit that is pulled out when trying to deal with these quite complex issues. And the sort of the final and third area is about sort of socially more integrate perpetrators and victims. In what way can perpetrators who make reparations, such as the special jurisdiction for peace in Colombia, as the FARC engaging with people that have taken hostages, how can paying compensation or doing community work or saying apologies reconcile those former warring parties? And this is the difficulty of conflict, in that it's often very removed. We sort of alienate victims and perpetrators from each other. Communities see each other as separate and different. And in a way, conflict is fought in a way to ensure that we dehumanize the other, because that makes it easier to kill and easier to hate. How do we undo that? It's incredibly difficult. This week we've released a report in Uganda which sort of spells out some of these issues, and also looks beyond just what the law and what the state does to look at how communities sort of cope with the violence. And so pictured here is the memory hut in Pader, where the local rot and families who have had their children kidnapped and have never returned in fighting the conflict note their names down and have sort of everyday objects to remember them, and also carry out sort of rituals like Minuin the millet, where they're calling back the children back for dinner that they would have practiced every day. And so it's a way of sort of communities coming together to remember. And one of our PhD students on the project, Paul Quinn, is doing the intersection of reparations and memorialization. How they sit together with communities' remembrance of the past versus sort of state narratives. And it's complex. And I think what I'm trying to say with the justice, morality, and reconciliation is that none of these get us to a sort of a perfect understanding of reparations. It's a bit of a mix of all these elements. And we can see this when we look at the reparations and how they're carried out and fulfilled by states, that even though reparations are sort of normative in that they're standards set out in international law, there's very little implementation in practice. There's a massive gulf. 85 to 90% of states don't carry out reparations. Even those countries which do, such as Peru, there's a real dissatisfaction in how reparations worked out. And so Clara and our Peruvian consultant were lucky enough to go up to Ayacucho and to visit some of the collective reparations. Some which worked, some which didn't. And effectively, you're giving money to a community which has been affected by the violence. Some members were perpetrators, some were victims, but you're buying them cows, giving them seeds, sort of like development feature and projects. But the difficulty is if it doesn't work, those victims have no second chances. They have no way of sort of recovering from their harm. And so we need to be very careful about how we sort of plan and carry out and also monitor reparations, that it's not just this one-off occurrence. And we can see this in South Africa, where you had the Truth Commission and you had the reparations that came out afterwards. The vast majority of victims were excluded, and very few benefited from that. Colombia, which is one of the biggest reparations programs in the world at the moment, has over 9 million victims now registered in its victims unit, yet only has a success rate of 11% in terms of implementation. that said, that's over 1 million people who've benefited from reparations, far more than Guatemala, Peru, and Nepal combined. So it's difficult somehow to measure, what does success look like with reparations? Is it the biggest numbers? Is it trying to get as many victims as possible? Or is it about trying to improve the quality of life and dignity of victims and try to tackle those underlying structural inequalities that drove the violence, or the sort of the values or lack of that allow people to engage in sort of political violence? And so what I've been sort of thinking about is, how do we get to this Goldilocks zone? So those familiar with space or whatever, about the search for exoplanets, is this notion of being just right. So if you've heard of the tale of Goldilocks, this shouldn't be too unfamiliar, but where you've got reparations, full reparations is a sort of inhabitable zone. In other words, it's never going to be possible. How do you do full reparations for the Holocaust or for the Colombian conflict? The state would have the money, or it wouldn't be feasible to do it. Do too little and do what you do in like Cambodia with the extraordinary chambers and dealing with international crimes of the Khmer Rouge. They've created reparations which are moral and symbolic. And my colleague Rachel Killian and I have got a piece coming out in the Melbourne Journal of International, which explores this when we interviewed victims there, where instead of giving victims measures that they wanted, such as scholarships for their children, they were put on plays and doing films, which to the victims, these organizations were telling are reparations. But for victims, didn't really address the stuff that they had and continue to have. And so these sort of maybe more moral and symbolic reparations sort of fall outside of being just right, about finding balance and compromise between not getting the perpetrators to be completely retributive in reparations and completely out of pocket for the rest of their lives, or bankrupt in the state, but having measures which are also adequate and effective for victims. And it's a difficult balance. I think part of the struggle with reparations is to get people involved and to understand and to find that point of being just right, the sort of Goldilocks zone. And there's a number of dilemmas with reparations. I'll just talk on 4 of these. Some of them which we have dealt with and it's become very apparent in Northern Ireland, which I'll talk about in a moment. But Muchwini is another video we've made on the website. Quite a complex case where you've got one member of a community in this village who's taken by the Lord's Resistance Army and then escapes with a weapon, and the LRA comes through and blames the other part of the community where this guy from and wipes out this whole clan in this community. And so the other side of the community is left with this sort of guilt, and how do they deal with an issue which they didn't explicitly carry out, but they're somehow complicit or at least tainted. And so the two communities have been trying to negotiate between themselves what reparations look like. But together, the whole village has got a school built by the state, and the state has framed this as reparations coming up to an election a few years ago. The difficulty is that the local people can't afford to send their children to it because the state doesn't provide any sort of scholarships for them. And so our colleague Peter Dixon on the project looks at the sort of the intersection of assistance and development with reparations, and how that is sort of difficult, and how this reparations are sort of politically framed but don't actually benefit victims. And so one of the key issues we've been looking at is victim responsibility to those reparations, and it's incredibly contentious. It can derail governments and how they deal with the past. That said, human rights law provides sort of broad notions that victims should not be discriminated when it comes to reparations. So if you've suffered torture, sexual violence, or family members being killed, it doesn't matter your background or what you've done in the past, you should be eligible to reparations. In practice, and in the case law of the Inter-American and European Courts of Human Rights, this has been eroded, or at least made more politically astute, in the sense that these courts have recognized that people who have committed war crimes or are involved in terrorist organizations maybe don't deserve full reparations. They're still victims, but they're perhaps not entitled beneficiaries. So it's maybe a bit of a legal fudge, but it's a way of sort of navigating these quite difficult moral quandaries about who's a victim and who's a perpetrator. And this has become very apparent in Northern Ireland. And many of you probably don't follow this, but in January this year, the UK government passed a law allowing victims who were seriously injured to have reparations. It was a big success. One of our local victims group, the We Have Injured group, has been campaigning for this for years, and so it was a massive success. The one difficulty was, in order to get the legislation and the system put in place, the two political parties in government had to sign off on this and provide a letter. And 5 months on, they haven't done this. And so victims who've campaigned morally and politically this for years and have legal success, now are disabled victims in their 60s and 70s are going to have to go to court. And so one of the victims, Jennifer, pictured here, has launched a judicial review. Last week, however, one of the victims, died before seeing this pension and this compensation paid to him. And this guy lived for 50 years, nearly with pain, after being shot in 1971. And so for victims, it feels that these issues never get resolved. They're constantly struggling. And sometimes they feel like beggars, or they're just waiting for those responsible to wait till the victims are all dead. And so it's really demoralizing in terms of how far they have to struggle. And at the end of the day, reparations do not come about because of charity of the state or the goodwill or political generosity. It's hard fought struggle to get reparations, whether through legal means, through the courts, through passing legislation, or out in the streets. Victims are constantly demanding that they be recognised as right holders and have dignity after suffering this violence and left with the consequences of it. So Northern Ireland and this pension issue, we thought we had success, and yet it's still not implemented. And this sort of reflects broader notions of how the past and how conflict pervades reparations, that reparations become a sort of a meta conflict. And some of you might be familiar with this notion of lawfare, where the war is ended, but it's the contest over who won is transferred and how we fight it out in court cases. And so in Nepal, pictured here, you've got continued contestation over whether child soldiers are victims or not, and how far the state should recognise them and provide redress. And also in Northern Ireland, pictured here, where we continue to have this support for paramilitaries and for these armed groups, that the grievances that started the conflict and the inequalities, people still see as legitimate in which the way in which the violence was used. And this is incredibly problematic then when we turn to reparations and who we recognise as victims, because effectively we're setting a standard and providing money and support to back it up, that certain victims deserve to be recognised, and that implicates those who committed those violence, that somehow it was wrong morally or legally. And this is the difficulties, that sometimes the conflict never ends. In Guatemala, Colombia, and even in Northern Ireland, human rights defenders continue to be killed. At a far larger extent in Guatemala and Colombia, but even last year in Northern Ireland, one of our very up-and-coming and award-winning journalists, Lara McKee, was shot dead up in Derry by one of these groups that for themselves as sort of new IRA. And what's interesting is how then people campaign then against these groups and get socially involved and carry like sort of political statements and to stand up against this sort of violence. And this is the difficulty, that for a lot of victims, the violence isn't explicit. It can be in the media, it can be in where they go to work or go to just social activities. Their whole way in which they live their lives is fundamentally changed. And so Cheryl Lawler and I and a few others, including our new postdoc, Kevin Hardy, have got a report coming out in the next week or so about the impact of displacement and violence in Northern Ireland and how that's fundamentally shaped how people continue to segregate themselves, and the grievances of the past continue to pervade their social life. And this is a big issue in Colombia, where they are set with the issue of thousands of victims continuing to be registered within the victims unit. And society factors like how to sort of turn this tap of victimization, guarantee it's not going to happen again when it's happening every single day. And for those who've seen in the last couple of weeks that the Army's has stated how a number of its members have committed sexual violence against Indigenous people, this stuff is normalised and continues to happen in the margins. And one of our other PhD researchers on the project, Sneva Gilmore, has been doing research around forced sterilisation in Peru, and how the Indigenous and campesinos in Peru were seen as sort of less than human or less than citizens, in which they'd be forcibly sterilised because they weren't part of the political system. last sort of thing I want to finish on is how do we engage then people who are responsible for violence? And I said at the start that with reparations, we see them as victim-centered. And I think that is only part of it. I think we need to involve society, but we also need to involve those responsible for violence. And for some armed groups we've engaged with, they've been quite engaged in victims' rights. Some who have demobilised see now victims and women's rights as part of their new struggle, and the way in which them sort of fighting for a better country and social transformation. There are difficulties to this, and we're going to have a number of publications coming out soon to attest to this. But armed groups, because they commit violence, because they also speak and have leadership for communities that they come from, tasks around inequality and discrimination, are a key part in sort of resolving the past and preventing it from happening again. Now, we spoke to groups in the Middle East who have been key in sort of mitigating the next generation from taking up arms the same way that they did, to members of the FARC saying they're engaging in sort of community work and apologies and reparations, but also that during the conflict, they weren't guardian angels when it came to civilians. They also have to confront the issues that they did and the violations to civilians. And so there's a number of complex issues of how we involve armed groups, especially when they can be displaced, destroyed, or even when they get into government, face the threat of dissidence. So can't be too politically generous in how far they go in apologising for the past. So in conclusion, and because I'm just interested in hearing your thoughts and views on some of the issues, is that reparations aren't easy. There's a massive gap in implementation. And there's also concern that reparations can become a sort of a state project or narrative on the past. And in a way, reparations are part of the contest, that they can be almost transformed politically and morally to serve maybe those who are in power. Also, that sometimes it's maybe takes a lot of time for victims to speak out. Sometimes when you've got protracted conflicts, it can last for decades before victims feel safe to come forward. And even at that, they could still face intimidation and violence, or even social stigma, and being ostracized from their community. One victim who we interviewed in Guatemala testified against Rios Montt, the former president, and she said it was one of the most proudest days of her lives, because she went up in front of him and confronted him and said, you killed my children. And he said, no, I didn't. She kept on confronting him and saying this. But when she returned home, she then suffered domestic violence. She was beaten by her husband, and suffered other consequences in her community. And so that shows the sort of tension between, this normative practice where we say we should do reparations for international crimes, for human rights violations, but we maybe overlook the everyday consequences for victims, and also how these reparations, we haven't done a proper longitudinal study of the impact that reparations have on victims' lives. Do they actually match up to these goals of justice, reconciliation, transformation? I don't know, and I don't think so. So then what can we do? What more modestly and honestly can we say and struggle for without reinforcing the status quo? How do we sort of change things or improve things after all this violence? So thank you for your attention. I hope it was interesting. I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and comments. And I'll just stop sharing the screen now so we can talk a bit more. Okay, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luke. And indeed, I think the presentation really threw up a number of dilemmas, issues, questions. And as you mentioned, in the participants, there are a number of individuals who have experience with reparations, either as a practitioner or a student of this issue. So while I certainly have a number of questions myself, perhaps I'll let the participants start with questions, and in order to try to make the experience a little bit more personal, if you are able to turn on your video so that we also see faces and not just voices, that is fantastic. If you cannot, that is also fine. So for instance, I see a question from Ahmad here. So Ahmad, would you like to proceed with your question?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Ahmed Helmi. I'm a virus activist from Syria, and I'm a founder and manager of a Syrian victim organization. victims of torture and enforced disappearance. Like as you know, in Syria, the conflict is still going. It's not ended yet, and we haven't reached any transitional phase. But you hear from time to time people talking about remedy and reparation for victims, and we believe that we should not accept that because sometimes like government or those who are in power will give like reparation and remedy instead of the other kind of justice, like accountability or revealing the fate of the missing person. So what do you think, like do you think that we should like stand against this call of reparation and remedy in Syria as long as the perpetrators are still in power?
Yeah, I think Ahmed, that's a really, really good question. And I suppose one of the key tensions in how you deal with the past, that reparations shouldn't be a way to buy impunity or to buy off victims. But at the same time, you know, how long will victims have to wait until the perpetrators, which is a whole regime, is put out? You know, do they wait to like a moment like Sudan had last year, where you know, people completely overthrew the government? And in the case of Syria, like how many decades from the Bashir's regime do you have to wait? I think any sort of negotiation around reparations always has these tensions. It can be useful to start talking about reparations because at least then the state is forced to confront all its victims, and it has to acknowledge and provide support to them. But it can't be as a way to sort of end any other claims or legal proceedings or investigations. And reparations in the UN Basic Principles is very big and all-encompassing. And one part of that is the measures of satisfaction and the guarantees of non-repetition, which are often, you know, thought as, particularly guarantees of non-repetition, something different and are separate from reparations. But they're a key part because victims, yes, money can help and rehabilitation is important, but also preventing recurrence. The victims aren't just thinking for themselves, they're thinking about their family, their children, their grandchildren. They don't want to be in the same system where they're walking down the street and there's a risk of them being taken again for torture or their children being killed or being targeted again. So guarantees of non-repetition are a key way of dealing with that, that those people responsible have to be removed from power. And after the Second World War, the German reparations programs suffered from that, because you had Nazi doctors and lawyers who are effectively saying these people aren't victims, they don't deserve reparations, and sort of continuing that narrative that the victims deserve to suffer, and that can cause more harm. I think also then the measure of satisfaction element is, it also includes the investigation and identification of those responsible. So the right to justice, the right to truth sort of notions. And you know, the UN Special Rapporteurs on transitional justice and many others have said you can't do one pillar of transitional justice, use of truth, justice, reparations, and non-recurrence, without the other. And so I think if you look at the different victims movements, some have focused on reparations, and this has caused some groups to fracture, and some people within the group start their own group who want just investigations or truth. And victims' views change over time. And so I think you can never exclude truth and justice, but you have to find ways of making compromise, that maybe only certain people will be prosecuted or certain people will be removed. It's difficult, but my concern is that transitional justice as a toolkit, it shouldn't be something that, okay, Colombia did this, so we should do that. Each country has to struggle, and it's difficult and it's messy, and it takes a lot of time, but to find what works. And I think talking to the perpetrators and those responsible is part of that, and it's always difficult. And it's, you know, with the case of the Israel and Germany speaking about Nazi crimes, some people protested, there was death threats, people were attacked, and I would say it's morally reprehensible that people who had killed so many Jews could talk to. But that conversation needs to happen, because at the end of the day, people have to live together with each other, and these things don't go away. the next generation, the children and the grandchildren, will still have these grievances. And so the longer we leave it, the worse it can get. But so I really there's another question here, but thank you so much for that question. Really good.
Luke, we've got 4 questions, 5 actually, but I'll take the 4 that were previously, the 2 on the chat and 2 in person. So I'll read the 2 in the chat, and then once you answer, I'll invite Nancy and Ayo to ask their questions. So Torsten asks, it's a complex one, but a few minutes on this. I was wondering whether you have any views or findings about the conditions under which victim organizations are more likely to be successful in claiming reparations. A big question. And the second one, you mentioned that ex-combatants would be eligible. Can you clarify how this is possible when reparations are aimed at victims and not perpetrators? And this is from Lindsay Holland. Maybe you could start from that, and then I'll ask Nancy and Ayo to ask their questions.
Yeah, these are really, really good questions. I think with the first one, Thorsten, around victim organizations, there's maybe no handbook for success of what makes a good victims organization. It's part of tenacity. It's part of how the group works and structures itself. I think if you look at the Japanese American case of success, where for about 20 years, or at least 18 years, they were talking about claim and redress, but they had the Japanese American Civil Liberties Association to work with, so they already had an organization there, and that the organization itself was talking about. I know Paul is also here, who's one of the members of the WAVE intragroup, and I suppose from them, groups like our local victims organizations, they've been quite effective in arguing for different issues around truth, justice and reparations, because there's funding there. There's funding to support the organisations, but also the organisations themselves are very well structured in terms of supporting victims and getting victims to engage the media in their own voices. That said, I know with other countries, and even in Northern Ireland, money changes things. And so sometimes victims organisations can't continue because there isn't sufficient funding for victims to meet. Or they are given funding and it changes the nature of the group. It no longer becomes an advocacy group, becomes more of a service provider. And that changes dynamics within the group. It changes who's getting what. Even like personality differences within groups can cause them to fracture. And so there's a whole range of issues. And maybe there's plenty of people here who can talk about the different victims groups that they're with and what makes success. I think there's no recipe for it. Sometimes it's just tenacity. And it's willing to pull on these different legal, moral, political levers in seeking change. So sorry, I don't have a good answer, but I have an answer. Tracy's question, or sorry, Lindsay's question about ex-combatants being eligible. Yeah, this happens in a number of contexts. Perhaps a good example is in Colombia last year, where the Constitutional Court recognized that female members of FARC who suffered abortions and other forced contraception within the group should be recognized as victims. Now, under the reparations law in Colombia and also Peru, members of ex-combatant groups can't be victims, but at least in Colombia, they have separate reintegration packages. And I suppose the thing with conflicts, and particularly those which are protracted and last for years and decades, that a lot of this violence can go on for a long time, and it gets really messy. So if you think of the Ugandan case at the ICC, Dominic Ogwin, he was a child on his way to school one day, and he was kidnapped and forced to become a member of an armed group. And so as a child soldier, it's both a victim and a perpetrator. And the same in the Holocaust. We had members who were in the concentration camps who were forced to then get involved in the carrying out of the violence, the Sudeten commandos. So there's these complex sort of identities and experiences that people have of being both victims and perpetrators. And so some can be eligible for reparations, but a lot of countries exclude them. And it's because of this moral notion that people who are perpetrators shouldn't benefit when they haven't actually made reparations to their own victims. I think that'll end that question there, because we'll probably discuss that more.
Thank you. Luke, questions are pouring in. Could I invite Nancy and Ayo? Perhaps we'll group the two together to ask your questions.
Okay, hello, hi. My question is regarding reparations for violations of socio-economic and cultural rights. What practical solutions and approaches should countries take towards this reparations? Thank you.
And Ayo?
Thank you, Luke, for your presentation. I happen to work in northern Uganda, where the research actually is picked from, and I'm happy that you're presenting about the area that I work. But currently, I'm doing my research on business and human rights at Ulster University, my doctoral research. But I want to ask the question. This is based on experience. Uganda was not in position to outrightly come out and say this is a reparation mechanism that we are going for, but we are going to reconstruct and rehabilitate the damaged communities. And they came up with a program called the Peace, Recovery and Development Program. I don't know if this would qualify within the framework of reparation. And secondly, the UN came up with a program called the UN Peace Building Program, which was for 1 year. I happened to implement that. And the question I'm also trying to bring, would this qualify within the framework of reparation? Then the last observation, sorry, this is the last one, then I'll get out, that I want to make is the question of lack of identity for people who are being born in captivity, and they cannot be accepted within the communities that they're coming from because it's a patrilineal society, and they will tell you, we don't know the father, even if the wives of these combatants come back with these children, they are not accepted as part of this. How should such now be dealt with within the framework of reparation? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy and Howard, for those questions. I think maybe I can sort of connect those up in terms of the socioeconomic and cultural violations. So with the socioeconomic violations, I suppose one of the key sort of reparations would be land restitution. Land is a key way for people to have economic productivity, but also have a sense of belonging and identity. And so reparations to some extent are able to undo the inequalities that have risen during conflict. And so Colombia and Guatemala have quite extensive reparations programs around returning land, but it's also incredibly difficult. I think Colombia has 65% of applications rejected when it comes to land restitution claims. That said, I think we need to see reparations as something more modestly, that reparations can't solve all our problems that we have in terms of structural inequalities, socioeconomic violations. It can to an extent, but other things need to play a part. And so Howard mentioned there the PDRP and the UN peace building funds. So you've got a government development program, and then you've got international donors providing funds and assistance to victims. And one thing that we see, and also a number of respondents who have benefited from these schemes would say, is that reparations are very much something that victims are entitled to because of the violation they suffered. Development and assistance are entitled to everybody who's been affected by conflict more generally. So that's one way of sort of distinguishing reparations. It's a legal sort of a justice concept. It's a connection between victim, the wrongdoing, and the wrongdoer. And also the state's obligation. So arguing there about people who are children born of war, children who have been abducted, or women who have been abducted and have had their children either in the bush or in other countries, and then when they return home, they have no legal identity. That's part of what we've suggested in our Uganda does actually tackle that those sort of victims should have access to identity cards, because this doesn't even just have consequences on them culturally, which I'll get to in a second, but also legally. So Redress and Impunity Watch held an event in October where some of the victims spoke about how they weren't able to go to university or hold bank accounts because they didn't have a national ID card. So it's about this not having your full rights as a citizen and being almost like second class, that you're not able to have dignity and your full human rights. The cultural issue, Howard, you talked about children born of war, about facing stigma in their communities. Again, you could say that reparations as measure of satisfaction should speak to these issues. But perhaps it goes beyond the state. Maybe it needs community and cultural leaders to step in and to educate, to also engage in conversations that stigma will continue, that these are children, these are part of our families, are part of our clans. I know Chris O'Kello wrote a piece there last year in the International Journal Transitional Justice, how some victims use stigma against perpetrators in order to punish them when they return home. We also spoke to a number of women who had children born of war and have had to move away from their villages and into towns, cities like Gulu. So there's a lot of tensions there. I think reparations can do so much. They can send messages, they can give value, they can recognise that victims have suffered this harm and measures to sort of alleviate the consequences of that harm, but they can't undo all the harm. So how do we think about how society, how communities can fill that gap?
Thank you for that. And we're going to hit the hour soon. So we'll just take the last round of questions. I see Kyle and Beatrice have the hand up, and we also have a question in the chat from Tracy. So if you could be as brief as possible, please.
Well, thank you very much. It was really interesting. I'm Beatrice and I'm a PhD student. And I wanted to ask, what is the role of sanctions, if you think that there is a role in sanctions, in particular of these alternative sanctions? And you put the example of Colombia, right? That it's a very comprehensive transitional justice system, which includes alternative sanctions such as community service. And do you think that these type of sanctions can achieve both certain level of accountability and at the same time contribute to reparations? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Potentially, there's possibility of the alternative sanctions. So those who are not familiar, in Colombia, under its war crimes court, members of the FARC and the Colombian army have reduced sentences if they engage in alternative sanctions. Now, it's not compensation, and it's not really restitution. It's more community work, as Beatrice mentioned, and apologies. I think in that way, this is what we're trying to say about, finding that Goldilocks zone of a balance between competing interests. You're incentivizing perpetrators to take ownership of their wrongdoing. But this is difficult because you also have to sell it to the rest of the organization and the communities that are affected. And it also requires your enemies to do the same with their victims. So in the case of case number 1, 001 in the HEP, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, it involves FARC kidnapping people, and the difficulties for them to recognise that what they did wasn't just detainment, it was hostage taking, it was a breach of Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. And so those tensions about how far do you recognise, how far can you bring an organisation, are some of the key contentions that victims will continue to push on in terms of getting proper acknowledgement. And that's maybe the more symbolic moral notions. In terms of the community work, I know some of the groups that we've engaged with, they've wanted to build a bakery in their own reintegration centre and get that recognised as an alternative sanction. But if there's no connection to how it benefits victims, it's very difficult for that community work then being seen as reparations. And so something we have suggested is, what role can FARC, when they're demobilised and out of the camps, help in mitigating violence, stop children being recruited from armed groups, help support community dispute resolution instead of people returning to arms. I think alternative sanctions offer a different vision. It will not work in all cases, but it shows that that middle ground, as well as the other things about investigations, a reparations program that are already existing. It's not just simply on its own. I think we've got a few more questions. Do you want me to answer Tracy's question? Yeah, okay. Okay, so Tracy's asking about the effects of transgenerational trauma in defining victims. I think it's a difficult issue, because reparations, in order to be fundable and feasible, has to have a cutoff point at somewhere of where those who suffer the most. And so one of the difficult issues is, to what extent can family members or successors, their children or grandchildren, parents or siblings, be eligible for reparations? And the transgenerational stuff is, there's perhaps a contested evidence around it. It is accepted in some areas, and at least in like psychological circles, and the impact of trauma, we can see it in Northern Ireland, and there's been some really good research done on that and how it impacts children and grandchildren, about to have increased rates of PTSD and one of the highest suicide rates in Western Europe. So it does have an impact. We're not good yet at measuring it and being able to apply policy. I know in the Katanga case at the ICC, they rejected children who were born after the massacre in Bogoro on the grounds of transgenerational trauma. So we have to draw a line somewhere. That said, in that case, those victims have been eligible to counselling. And so maybe our strict lines about who's eligible perhaps requires being a little bit nuanced in terms of who benefits. That maybe some victims benefit from certain services and others get compensation or other measures. So I think we can find a bit of a balance. I know there's other questions that are there. Can we go beyond 5 o'clock, or do you want to finish? Or
I don't think we should go much beyond, but we can speak for another 5 minutes. So I see Kyle and Celine, and there are a few questions in chat. I think we'll have to draw a line for questions at this stage. And so Kyle and Celine, if you could ask your questions, and then there is Brittany. Quite a long question over there, and Ahmad makes a comment. So it's just those last three, please. Kyle?
Yeah, okay. In the context of the Ugandan memory hut and the milling of the millet, when it comes to kind of ritualizing a cultural memory of a past transgression, do you think there's any benefit to keeping those kinds of projects secular? Thank you.
Okay, that's a good question. And I suppose this is a broader notion within human rights law and international law in general, about how far do we allow sort of local practices to guide the way in effective reparations. So should reparations have cultural meaning? And one of my PhD researchers, Shifra, is actually doing that in terms of sexual violence. And this is difficult, because we spoke to Joseph Kony's clan chief, his spiritual advisor, and also other clan chiefs, and they talked about proper reparations when one clan kills members of another clan would be to hand over a young girl, in order to ensure reconciliation. And I think most people would say that's not appropriate reparations as we understand it today. And so I don't want to say that there's no value in cultural understands or cultural practice of reparations. I think they play a key part, but where it causes harm to another, or where it doesn't involve consent of those involved, perhaps it shouldn't be practiced. That said, when we talk about reparations, we think of it as a very uniform and universal notion. I know in Nepal, the notion is Puri Quran, and Ram Badari has recorded video for us on our project website, which talks about that it doesn't actually mean reparations as we would understand it. It maybe more reflects a sort of a caste notion of you're obliged to pay to somebody else for a wrong done. Or even in the Guatemalan Maya Cheese, their understanding and cosmovision of reparations is very different. So it's about finding common ground without sort of bulldozing over the sort of complex understandings people have in resolving conflicts themselves. So thanks, that's a good question.
Celine?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Very quick question. I was very interested. First of all, thank you very much. It was super interesting. Though I work a lot on this issue, and you see I'm learning. So just one question. I was very interested when you mentioned the discrimination or the perception of being discriminating among victims. So I have two questions. I see that on the field very much also. So I know what it is. So do you have more to say about that? And connected to this question, and we both are involved in this, and I'm working on sexual violence in conflict. But I was wondering, there is a move on reparation, which is a good one, regarding victims of sexual violence, but I see also on the field how other victims, I mean, not of sexual violence, but victims of conflict, feel not being taken into consideration for that. And the last question, a bit all is very interconnected, but we're talking about reparation that is supposed to be, so to speak, I would say that the obligation of states, or doing that. The creation of more a global fund, private, like the Global Survivor Funds for sexual violence. And I'm working on it, so I'm just precising this, that it's not an attack on it. But do you think that it can also add on this perception of discrimination? I hope I'm clear. Sorry.
Yeah. We're good, but difficult questions. Yeah, so with the first issue about like discrimination, and I think it goes back almost to Thorsten's question about victim organisations, that when there's money or reparations involved, it does involve some form of competition, that you're trying to say that some victims are more deserving than others. And in factual terms, some victims have suffered more harm, or at least are able to evidence more harm. And this issue of discrimination, of how we sort of distinguish victims from others, it's difficult. I think the UN Basic Principles says that you can't discriminate people based on status. That said, if you look at the German laws around the Holocaust victims in the 1950s, the first laws, it said only people who were German nationals who suffered crimes within the territory of Germany were eligible. And this is only West Germany, so it was actually a very few victims. And years later, victims campaigning in the 70s, 80s, 90s broadened that out to include those who were fleeing from Eastern Europe, and then after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So things do change. There is that tension and almost victim competition, and that maybe also speaks then to your second question about sexual violence, that if there's a lot of focus around sexual violence, and it's almost like it is a celebrity cause, as we saw with the UK's government involvement to end sexual violence with Angela Jolie, and with the best intentions of sort of tackling these crimes and sort of breaking down the stigma that we need to speak out on these issues. And we've got a really good report written by Clara, Sneva and Julie that touches upon some of those issues. But it does then sort of highlight what sort of sexual violence is worth recognising and deserving. Doesn't mean, are we going to talk about how children are sexually abused, or male victims of sexual violence, or those within armed groups? And so I know the Takanda case at the moment at the ICC is looking at how child soldiers were sexually abused, but also now they're adults. So how do we sort of deal with that when they're also responsible for committing crimes against others? And that's always been a tension at the ICC. With the first case in reparations, Lubanga, we have child soldiers who are being prioritised as victims, because again, child soldiers was the celebrity issue at the time, and as a way of sort of sending moral messages, armed groups shouldn't be using children. Maybe the last thing about obligation of states, I think we need to use as many means as possible to provide support to victims, and that doesn't always necessarily have to be reparations. Legal obligations and the international norms that we have that say that states should provide redress and remedies and reparations isn't always played out in practice. Some states don't have the capacity. Often it's the political will. And this speaks also then trust funds. You look at the trust fund of the ICC, it gets in about 3 to 4 million euros per year. Lubanga in the first case, probably the smallest case with the number of victims, 3,000 victims, let's say, is like he had a liability of $10 million. And yet that far outstrips the trust fund's resources, which also has an assistance mandate. And if you look at other countries, Sierra Leone, Nepal, where there's trust funds or funds provided by donors, it often doesn't have a sustainable avenue of raising funds. And it takes a lot of work, so it does, to fundraise and to support victims. And so that's why it requires states to have some ownership, to almost have a cost to them, an economic one, where they have to set money down with their values. And so there's an ownership there that can hopefully have more sustainability. So Pablo de Grief in his 2014 report on reparations, talks about this, about trust funds, but it requires states, he says, to have a dedicated budget line. And reparations cost a lot, but they aren't explicitly prohibitive. There's means and way of finding the money. It's often the political will. And so a trust fund can be helpful in the short term. And I think in the report that Sneha and Julie wrote, talks about that, about having sort of immediate and priority measures for victims of sexual violence to sort of mitigate the long-term harm. But reparations often take years or decades to come through. And so it's maybe the longer term version if we're getting states to do this. Do maybe trust funds interfere with that by states being saying, well, international donors are going to fund this, so I don't need to deal with it. So there's those sort of tensions, and hopefully I've answered your questions. I realize there's other questions in the...
Luke, I'm happy to take one final one, perhaps.
From the chat?
Brittany has offered to read her question out. So.
Okay, great.
And this will be the final question because we've now gone over it.
Okay, I'll jump in. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Luke, thank you so much. This was really, really helpful to hear. So I'm actually researching changing compensation mechanisms in the imperial relationships between the US and the Marshallese and the UK and Chagosian. So that's where I'm coming from. And my first question is really based on that because when people were displaced, they went to different places and received different compensation packages. So that's what informs this. So my question is whether you've come across any kind of where reparations go, i.e. if people are located in different places, a city center versus somewhere more rural, if there are trends in where governments see and address injustice versus other places that perhaps get less attention. So the where of reparations over time. That's my first question. If there's any trends about that. And the second is also informed by working with islanders, but I'm wondering if you see future injustice being addressed through a reparations framework, so less so ongoing conflict, though that's there, but more so future injustice, for example, environmental or climate change affecting these same populations that have perhaps been moved, and whether you see that as something that would be using these historical justice templates in any way, climate reparations, that sort of thing. So I know those are a little bit off from what you've talked about, but I'm just curious if any thoughts strike you.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Those are good, big questions. I'll try my best to answer them. I think with the geography aspect, it's something that really hasn't been properly explored. There's been stuff done by ICTJ, like Christian Carrera and Ruben Carranza, around how sort of urban elites benefit more from reparations because they're closer to those in power and you're better educated, have more means in order to articulate and put pressure on the state to prioritise them. I know in Côte d'Ivoire at the ICC, it was one of the issues around how the court itself was engaging with victims and those who were being seen. And some of the work that we've been doing around Northern Ireland, I know it's a very different sort of case. It is islanders, but there's a really good book that came out. It's a massive book by Brendan O'Leary about colonialism. Looks at how people in Ireland were affected by 400 years of settlement and occupation and conflict, and how people who were seen close to the state, mainly Protestant Unionists, lived in towns and industrialised areas where sort of the minority Catholic population was pushed out to the margins, to sort of the rural and bad quality land. So I think there's a real geographical impact to that. And I can't think of the top of my head. Well, we've got a report coming out in the next couple of weeks, which I'll pick out some of that literature. But I know that Max Counter is doing really, really interesting work in Colombia around geography and reparations. And so maybe he'd be a good person to look into his work. Also, in terms of the second question around the environmental climate change, really with reparations, it's a way of claims making. It's a way of saying, that I've suffered this harm and this is what the state should do. And so it's about getting priority and it's about making this a political issue using legal tools and also having a moral weight to it. I think with climate change, it could be, and I know there's really good work done by Maxine Burnett around the legal claims to reparations for climate change. I know some colleagues have also worked on the notion of like ecocide and reparation. Like Rachel Killian's got something coming out soon on that. it's incredibly difficult. I think the historical injustice claims, what has become apparent is that when victims are dead, legally so are their claims. And that means that reparations aren't over. It means that they change in the sort of moral political claims. And we see this with like the transatlantic slave trade, where the Caribbean nations, CARICOM, has changed their reparations demands from being about compensation to being about the structural and symbolic issues. But also, if you look at the sort of the Mau cases and also claims being made against the Dutch for its role in Indonesia, those victims are still alive. Now, the historical injustice context about doing the sort of structural, the environmental impact of long-term abuses could also be transponded into the climate change, because effectively the victims are still alive. But how do you set that sort of causal link between those who are suffering and those who are responsible? Do we sort of tax the biggest polluters and then use that money to provide to those most affected, like the Aleutian Islanders who are losing their territory? Or do we focus on those who are more explicit, such as environmental war crimes? It's a difficult issue, but I think with reparations you need to make that causal link between those responsible and those who are victimized. So I think I'll end there, but thank you so much for those questions. They were great. You can of course email me at l.moffett@qub.ac.uk or connect with me through Twitter. Thank you to Aldo and ARU for hosting this today. I hope you've found it useful.
And from our end, a big thank you, Luke. It was a really thought-provoking, interesting presentation. I'm sure all participants here agreed. The volume of questions and the discussion is testimony to that. So thank you very much. I apologize, went slightly over time, but that only shows the level of interest in the presentation. So thanks for that. Thank you, Luke. And I'll close by inviting participants, anyone who's interested in continued interest in access to justice and inclusion, to join our next webinar on the 16th of July at the same time, 4 p.m. UK time. And this time it will be a practitioner speaking, Anita Grotievich, who will be presenting on inclusion of migrants in the community. Anita runs the Rosmini Center in Vispe and has years of experience in relation to promoting inclusivity and migrants in the community. So thank you very much to everyone, and especially thank you to Luke for this very interesting presentation.
Hi, Alan. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye.